On the pasuk in this parsha, Hein Heina Hayu Levnei Yisrael B'dvar Bilam Limsor Mal Ba'Hashem, this is referring to the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu had told the Yidden when they came back from the war against Midian, and they had left the Midianite women alive. Moshe Rabbeinu is saying that these are the women who caused the Yidden to rebel based on the words of Bilam. Rashi quotes the words B'dvar Bilam and explains, Amar Lahem, Bilam had said to them, even if you're going to gather all the multitudes of the world, all the armies of the world, you're never going to be able to overcome the Yidden, because are you greater, are you more than the Egyptians who had 600 chosen chariots? Let me give you some advice. The God of these Jews hates immorality, etc. And Rashi concludes with the words, K'de'isa b'Chelek, as we have learned in the Perek Chelek that's in Gemara Sanhedrin, as well as in the Sifri. Now, the fact that Rashi has to explain anything over here at all, that this was the advice of Bilam, even though Rashi had technically told this to us already, both in Parshas Balak on the words of Bilam, L'cha iyotzcha, let me give you some advice, as well as the end of that parsha on the pasuk, Vayachel ha'am liznois al b'nois Moav, when the Yidden start acting in immoral ways with the daughters of Moav. So it's understood why Rashi is telling it to us over here, because our pasuk is actually the source from where we learn that this is all Bilam's advice. As Rashi had actually said in Parshas Balak on those words, L'cha iyotzcha, that the proof that Bilam was the one that gave them this advice to cause them to stumble, to sin with immoral acts, is because the pasuk says, quoting our parsha, Hein Heina Hayu Levnei Yisrael B'dvar Bilam. However, we need to understand, says the Rebbe, why does Rashi need the whole arichus? Where he says to them, Amar Lahem, he says to them, even if you're going to bring all the multitudes of the world, and are you more than the Egyptians who had the 600 chosen chariots, etc.? Why is all of this relevant? And the Rebbe elaborates. Number one, why is this at all relevant to explaining our pasuk? Number two, if Rashi, for whatever reason, wants to bring these things that Bilam said, it seemingly would have been more appropriate to bring it, where Rashi is explaining all of this for the first time in Parshas Balak on those words, L'cha iyotzcha. So why is Rashi suddenly bringing it over here? We also need to understand a number of diyukim in the words of Rashi. Number one, Bilam says, even if you're going to bring all of the multitudes of the world, you're not going to be able to overcome the Yidden. Why? Because are you more than the Mitzrayim, more than the Egyptians? The Rebbe says, what kind of proof is this? Yes, it's true that you, the Moavites, the Midianites, are not more than the Egyptians, but if you bring all of the multitudes of the world, of course that's more than the Egyptians. So what do you mean, even if you bring all the multitudes of the world, are you more than the Egyptians? Of course they're more than the Egyptians. The Egyptians are one nation, and no matter how great, how many they were at the time, so definitely it still would have been fewer than bringing all the armies of the whole world. Furthermore, we actually saw already earlier that Moshe Rabbeinu says this to Hashem. Moshe Rabbeinu says to Hashem that when the Eibishter wanted to chas v'shalom kill the Yidden before taking them to Eretz Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu says that the nations are going to say that the Eibishter Hashem was not able to bring them into Eretz Yisrael, and they're going to say that even though Hashem was able to overcome Paroi, nevertheless, that does not compare to 31 kings of the land of Eretz Yisrael. In other words, of course there's armies greater than Paroi. So certainly, if we're speaking about all the multitudes of the world, of course they're more than Paroi and more than Mitzrayim. So what's Bilam saying? On the other hand, asks the Rebbe, if Bilam does want to describe the might, the power of Mitzrayim, then why does Rashi say that they had 600 chosen chariots? And he doesn't mention that what the pasuk itself says over there, that besides those 600 chosen chariots, there's v'chol rechav Mitzrayim, there's all the chariots of Egypt, v'shalishim al kuloi, with all of the officers and riders, etc., it says, etc. As it could also be understood simply that only such a tremendous amount of chariots, together with all of the other multitudes of Egypt, that's what brought out such a fear that the Yidden had when we're speaking about 600,000 men, besides the women and the Erev Rav, etc., etc., etc. So only that would have scared off the Yidden. So we're not only speaking about the 600 chariots. So why is it that Rashi is only quoting about 600 chariots? Now, seemingly you could say that with 600 chariots, Rashi is trying to emphasize not the specific number of these 600, rather saying 600 is only the chosen chariots, from which we would understand that there's much more in the rest of the chariots and wagons and army of Egypt. However, the Rebbe says this is still not so simple and smooth, because then Rashi should have at least hinted to that by at least saying v'goimer, in other words, more than the 600 chariots. Or at least not to say shahayu, that they were 600, which is allowing us to think that maybe that's all they were. Rashi could have used some other expression, similar to the Sifri, some other expression from which we can understand that we don't mean to limit it and to restrict it just to the 600. Another question that Rebbe asks is, what is the expression that Bilam says, Boyu, come, and I will give you some advice? What is this expression of come? Another thing that Rebbe asks is, Rashi concludes, and he says, after quoting what Bilam says, he says, v'chulu, etc., k'de'i says, it says, b'chelek u'b'sifri. Now, seemingly, that word v'chulu, etc., is referring to all of the details that we find later, both in Sanhedrin, in that Peruk of Chelek, as well as in Sifri. The question that Rebbe has is, why is it relevant, all the things that are discussed later in Chelek, what Bilam says to them, and the whole story, the way it happens, and it's not enough just to quote the way it says in Sifri, which is basically more or less the way Rashi is telling us over here, and a bit more. And the Rebbe is about to explain in a moment why the Sifri would be more suitable. The Rebbe goes on and asks, even if Rashi wants to bring both from Chelek and the Sifri, seemingly the Sifri should have been first, because number one, the Sifri is the one that's directly explaining our pasuk. It's the one that's explaining everything going on in our pasuk. Also, the whole beginning of Rashi, where Bilam says to them that even if you're going to bring all the armies of the world, etc., that's actually all coming from the Sifri. In Perek Chelek, the main arichos over there is going to be more with the fact that Hashem doesn't like the immorality and what happened as a result of that, etc., etc. So why is that all going to be relevant over here? From all of this, as the Rebbe, we can understand that when Rashi says K'de'isa b'sifri, he's not only coming to tell us the source where the beginning of his Rashi is coming from, that even if you're going to bring all the armies of the world, etc., you're still not going to be able to overcome the world, because the reason for this is because this is really understood itself. It's obvious in Pshutei Shel Mikra. It's also, says the Rebbe, not coming to tell us the details of what happens, what the Sifri tells us in continuation to this idea that Hashem hates the immorality, which the details of this really we find in the Gemara in Chelek, but rather Rashi is referring to something in Sifri which is going to be specifically connected with that which is discussed in the Gemara in Perek Chelek. That means there's something in the Sifri that's going to clarify to us in regards to this general idea of Elokeim Shel Elu Soine Zimu, regarding the fact that Hashem despises the immorality. So to explain all of this, says the Rebbe, the difference simply between the pasuk in our parsha and the pasuk in Parshas Balak. In Parshas Balak, the words were L'cha iyatzcha, let me give you some advice. And that's why Rashi over there just says, what was the advice? The advice was that Hashem hates promiscuity. On the other hand, when it comes to the pasuk in our parsha, it doesn't say that when Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking to the Yidden, he's not saying that these were the women that came ba'atzaz Bilam through the advice of Bilam. He uses the pasuk uses the term bidvar Bilam, by the words of Bilam. That seems to be implying that together with the advice that Bilam gave, there was also some other things that he had said which are connected to that advice. Now, from the fact that this is all coming in connection to the argument of Moshe Rabbeinu, why is it that you didn't kill the women in this war? It's understood that somehow these words that Bilam said are specifically connected to this idea, to the war that the Yidden were waging against the Midyanim. Says the Rebbe, this is why Rashi does not explain only what the advice of Bilam was, but he's also coming to tell us what the Dvar Bilam, what else did Bilam say? And what did he say? This is what Rashi tells us. He told him that even if you're going to get together all the armies of the world, you're not going to be able to overcome the Yidden. And this is why he's advising them, Elikeim shel elu soynezima, how Hashem despises the inyan of znus, the inyan of immorality. What's Moshe Rabbeinu saying? And what was going on over here? So the Rebbe says as follows. Moshe Rabbeinu was arguing to the Yidden. You allowed these women to live. These are the people that caused all the problems with the story of Pa'or, the Avodah Zarah of Pa'or, and the Znus, etc., etc. And this brought about the Magefa amongst the Yidden. What's Moshe Rabbeinu saying? He's not only saying that they in the past had caused the Yidden to do an Aveira, and therefore a Magefa, a plague, had broken out. What Moshe Rabbeinu is saying, we're dealing with a war right now over here. We're supposed to be fighting the Midyanim. Moshe Rabbeinu is getting angry at the officers of the war that are coming from war. In other words, what Moshe Rabbeinu is telling these Yidden is that these women were basically part of the war effort. In other words, Midyanim, when they sent these girls, these women to do Znus, it was in a way that they were actually trying to fight the Yidden. They were trying to, Rahman al-Islam, destroy the Yidden. And this was actually all part of Dvar Bilam. This is what Bilam had actually said. In other words, Bilam had told him, you want to fight the Yidden? We're speaking about war. With a Gashmi is the Mulchama, there's no way you're going to overcome the Yidden, even if you bring all the armies of the world. And this is why, let me give you some advice, that Hashem hates immorality, and this is the way you're going to be able to fight them. In other words, Benois Midyan are they are the ones that are really waging that war of Midyan against the Yidden. And this is why what's relevant over here is not just that Bilam gave advice, just saying that this is what you should do, but rather Dvar Bilam, the whole point how he was making it, that this is the way you're going to wage a war, because there's no other way how you are going to, even with gathering all the armies of the world, are you going to be able to overcome the Yidden. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand exactly all the details of what Bilam exactly is saying. Bilam says to them, even if you're going to get together all the multitudes of the world, you're not going to be able to overcome them. Now for this, Bilam does not have to bring any proof whatsoever. Balak had already clearly seen that even Sicha and Oig, the strongest kings, that no one was able to conquer them. They were the ones that were hired to protect the nations from the Yidden. Yidden overcame them in such a supernatural way, in such an amazing way, that all of the might of Sicha and Oig were completely irrelevant and insignificant once the Yidden came about. In other words, the Goyim saw clearly already, Balak saw clearly already, that physical might, and whether it is strength in quantity or in quality, is not going to be in any way whatsoever able to overcome the Yidden. Balak and Midyan, however, had another svara, they had another idea that perhaps we could overcome the Yidden with a spiritual war. In other words, just like they hired Bilam to chase away the Yidden, they hired Bilam to try to fight a spiritual war. They said, go curse the Yidden with the spiritual power which he has as a Navi, as a prophet, Yodea Das Elyon. So too right now, once Bilam was not successful, they think maybe we could find some other people with more spiritual powers to be able to overcome the Yidden. Says Bilam to them, it's for this that he's saying to them, Shema merubim atem, are you more than the Egyptians that had the 600 chosen chariots? What's he referring to? He's not referring to the number 600, that it's such a huge army, the physical might and power of the army of Mitzrayim. Rather, what he's referring to is spiritual might. As Rashi explains, where did these animals come from? Where did these 600 chariots, the animals for these 600 chariots come from? Rashi had explained already that these were from Mehayored as Dvar Hashem, from those that feared Hashem. Otherwise, they should have died by the Matos. In other words, we're speaking about people of a spiritual greatness, fearing Hashem. So it's not about how many there were in number. And nevertheless, even these 600 people that seemingly were on a greater spiritual level, it didn't help them anything at all. And when they started up with the Yidden, they had a very, very bitter end. This is what Bilam is saying to them, that there's no point in trying to find people with any sort of spiritual qualities to be able to overcome the Yidden, because in that area, are you going to be more than the Egyptians, which were the ones that feared Hashem, and yet there was nothing they were able to do against the Yidden. So what could possibly be of something that could help them fight the Yidden? Bilam says to them, come, let me give you advice. Come a little bit closer to me. Let me give you some quiet, secret advice. Let me give you a tactic over here that Hashem hates immorality, and maybe through this you'll be able to achieve your goal. Says the Rebbe, the Ben Chamish Lipskier asked, we don't find throughout the whole 40 years that the Yidden were in the Midbar, the Yidden should ever do these kind of Averos. Furthermore, in the story of Shloimis Bas Divri, which was one woman that had gone off and not done the right thing, Rashi says that the fact that the Torah tells us about Shloimis Bas Divri, this was actually saying the praise of the Yidden, that she was a one and only person that acted in an inappropriate way, in an immoral way. And from this we certainly understand also regarding the men that none of them were involved in these sorts of Averos. So how does it make sense, asks the Ben Chamish Lipskier, that suddenly so many Yidden are falling through to the extent that we know that in that Magefa, in that plague, 24,000 Yidden die? Another question, what is this idea that Bilam is saying, boy, you come close, I want to give you a secret, I want to tell you a secret. And this is what Rashi means when he says to the Isa, B'Chelek, when he's sending us off to have a look in the Masechta Sanhedrin Perek Chelek. Over there, it's discussed in great detail how the Yidden were basically tricked and fooled. They were given wine, jugs of wine, until eventually they fell through with these Averos of Znus and Avodah Zarah. And therefore, since it was all done in a way of plotting and planning with secrecy, if Yidden would have known the plan of Bilam, that this is how he's going to get them, of course they would have been much more careful of having the wine of the Goyim, etc. And therefore Bilam is telling them in a secret, in other words, the Yidden shouldn't be able to find out his sly tricks and his sly tactics. Says the Rebbe, but there's still a question. The Gemara tells us over there how exactly Bilam's plan came about. The Gemara said that they had made a lot of tents, going all the way from Har Chelek to Beis HaYeshimos. In these tents, they had set up the Zoinos. They set up elderly women on the outside of the tents and young women on the inside of the tents. The Yidden were coming there and eating and drinking and rejoicing, etc., and going and strolling in these marketplaces. The elderly woman would try to get to sell something to the Yid, and then when he would come over, she would say, come inside, and there's something even better inside, etc., 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 till finally they got the Jew to do the Avera. So again, the same question could come up. How does it even make sense that the Yidden were walking around these marketplaces, eating and drinking and rejoicing and strolling amongst these tents of the women of Midian? Especially we're speaking about times that were after tremendous miracles that the Yidden had just experienced. Eshed Hanacholim is referring to the time when the mountains crushed together, crushing the Goyim that were hiding inside to try to start up with the Yidden. They had the Milchemes Oig, where Oig tried to rip up a mountain to throw on the Yidden, and he was killed. So it seems to be obvious that this should have brought about by the Yidden opposite sort of behavior. They should have been acting in an extra good way. So what's going on over here? And this is why Rashi tells us to have a look in the Sifri. In the Sifri that's dealing specifically with this idea, it's going to be relevant to that which we were just speaking about in Chelek. What is that? In Sifri, in Parshas Balak, that means not the Sifri on our apostle, but in Sifri in Parshas Balak, it says as follows. When the Yidden had plenty of the spoils of the Milchama of Sicha and Oig, the Yidden suddenly were acting in a way, because they had so much of these spoils, that they were completely disgracing it. And they were tearing the clothes that they got. They were throwing it away. They were tearing and and destroying the animals, throwing it away. Because all they were now interested in was just silver and gold. In other words, all of the great spoils that the Yidden had by the Milchama, that actually caused that the Yidden were, as the Pasuk describes, Vayishman Yeshurun Vayivot, Which means, Rahman al-Itzlan, when Yidden get fat from all of these extra things, suddenly they're rebelling. And as a result of that, this is why suddenly they were acting in this way, this inappropriate way, till finally do the actual Averis. So in summary, just to summarize some of the main points that the Rebbe explained over here, is number one, is the fact that Bilam was saying that, are you greater than all the multitudes of the world? With this, Bilam was clearly saying to them that, of course, a Gashmi is definitely not the way you're going to be winning over the Yidden. Because you saw already people like Sicha and Oig weren't able to overcome the Yidden. Even with a Ruchni Yizdika war, meaning getting people that are especially great and spiritually to be able to fight the Yidden, you're also not going to be able to manage, because the Egyptians had already 600, so to speak, spiritual people, great people that feared Hashem, and they weren't able to overcome the Yidden. So Bilam gives them advice. Let me show you how to fight the war by getting these women to entice the Yidden to this Aveira. And this is why it's all relevant specifically. It's part of the war of these Midyanim against the Yidden. And the Rebbe also explained why it's relevant, these two ideas, both in Perek Chelek, as well as that of the Sifri, because in Perek Chelek we see how the Yidden were tricked into doing the Aveira through the wine, and etc., etc. And in Sifri, what we see is how they even came to that, why they even strolling these marketplaces, is all because of the Vayishman, Vayishur, and Vayivad, because of the excessive Gashmis that they suddenly had, which brought them to a situation which led them to the inappropriate behavior. The Rebbe says in Seif Zayin, Yeina Shal Torah, in Pirush Rashi. By Melchemes Midyan we find that Hashem says, Nekoim Nikmas B'nai Yisrael, take the revenge for the Yidden from the Midyanim. Moshe Rabbeinu, when he gives over this command, says, Lases Nikmas Hashem b'Midyan, to give the revenge of Hashem in Midyan, not the Nikam of B'nai Yisrael. Says the Rebbe that my father, that means Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, explains the reason for this difference. Hashem is caring about the honor of the Yidden. So he speaks about the revenge of the Yidden. Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking about the honor of Hashem, and that's why he says it's the revenge of Hashem. In fact, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak over there also explains in a similar way, when the Eibishter in his command in Parshas Truma speaks about making the Kruvim before the Aroin, in Parshas Nosoi the way it's described as the Aroin before the Kruvim, and it's again symbolic of a similar sort of idea of which one is being looked at. Is the Eibishter looking at the Yidden first, and what represents the Yidden, on the other hand, Moshe Rabbeinu giving over that which represents Hashem first. However, we need to understand why is there this difference, and these two ideas specifically by the Melchama of Midyan, why don't we find this in other areas in the Torah? Says the Rebbe, but based on the way we explained Rashi now, it's all understood. The Melchama of Midyan with the Yidden actually had two aspects to them. There's one aspect where they're fighting the Yidden, they're trying to destroy the Yidden, and therefore there's the idea of Nikmas B'nai Yisrael, the revenge of the Yidden. There's another idea that Bilam is speaking about the fact that Hashem hates immorality, and therefore it's a fight against Hashem. And that's why it's Nikmas Hashem, the revenge of Hashem. And therefore, Hashem that's medaktik in the covet of the Yidden. So out of these two things, he's focusing on the idea that is the revenge on behalf of Bnei Yisrael. In other words, the fact that they wanted to destroy the Yidden. Moshe Rabbeinu, that cares so much about the honor of Hashem, is emphasizing that it's the revenge of Hashem. That means even when, yes, they're trying to destroy the Yidden, but it's in a way by fighting Hashem, because Hashem is the one that hates the immorality. And therefore, they want to get the Yidden to do this Aveira along with Avodah Zorah and Baal Poir, etc. Says the Rebbe, now we could also understand why Rashi explains on the words Nikmas Hashem. Rashi says that when someone stands up against the Yidden, it's like standing up against Hashem. And again, why is the Torah telling it to us specifically over here by the Melchama of Midyan? Because it's right over here that we're seeing clearly that the way to stand up against the Yidden was by standing up against Hashem, by getting the Yidden to do the Aveiros of Znus, and through that also Avodah Zorah. Says the Rebbe, this is why the Torah over here in Parshas Matos specifically says the words Bidvar Bilam, not only Atzaz Bilam, not only the advice, but all the words that Bilam said, because this helps us understand really what the whole point of the Melchama of Midyan was, that it was both the revenge of Hashem and the revenge of Bnei Yisrael.